A simple elderly woman denied entry to luxury mall. Her billionaire son arrives minutes later. The morning sun cast long shadows across Fifth Avenue as Margaret Wilson adjusted her worn cardigan, smoothing it over her simple floral dress. At 78, her movements were deliberate, her fingers slightly gnarled from arthritis. But there was a quiet dignity in how she carried herself. She had taken the bus from her modest apartment in Queens, making the journey into Manhattan with a determination that belied her years. The Platinum Galleria loomed ahead, its glass facade reflecting the autumn sky like a mirror. Margaret clutched her small handbag closer, its leather cracked and faded from decades of use. Inside was a carefully folded note with an address and a time, 2 p.m. The Diamond Room, Platinum Galleria. Today was Robert's birthday, and despite his protests that she needn't make the trip, she wouldn't miss it for the world. She paused for a moment, watching people stream in and out of the entrance, women in designer clothes with perfect hair, men in custom suits talking into phones worth more than her monthly rent. Margaret took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders. She had raised a son who now moved in these circles. Surely she could navigate them for one afternoon. As she approached the revolving doors, a tall security guard in a tailored black suit stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over her practical shoes, the hem of her dress where she'd mended a small tear last week, and the cardigan she'd owned since before he was born. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, positioning himself between Margaret and the entrance. "The Platinum Galleria is a private establishment. May I ask about your business here today?" Margaret looked up at him, her blue eyes clear and steady. "I'm meeting my son for his birthday lunch at the Diamond Room." The security guard's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. "The Diamond Room? That's our premium dining venue." He gestured to a small podium nearby. "Perhaps you'd like to check with our concierge about your reservation." Margaret nodded and made her way to the concierge, a young woman whose smile faltered slightly as Margaret approached. "Hello, dear. I'm here for a lunch reservation at the Diamond Room. The name should be under Wilson or perhaps Richardson." The concierge tapped at her tablet, her manicured nails clicking against the screen. "I'm sorry, but I don't see any reservation under those names. The Diamond Room is fully booked for private events today." Her tone was polite but dismissive, her eyes already looking past Margaret to the well-dressed couple approaching behind her. "There must be some mistake," Margaret said, her voice soft but firm. "My son specifically mentioned 2 o'clock. Perhaps you've confused the venue," the concierge suggested, not unkindly. "There's a lovely diner about 3 blocks east that's quite popular." Margaret stood her ground, years of raising a headstrong son having taught her patience. "I'm certain it's the Diamond Room. Could you check once more, please?" The security guard had moved closer, exchanging a glance with the concierge. "Ma'am, if you don't have a confirmed reservation, I'll have to ask you to step aside. We have other guests waiting." For the first time, Margaret felt a flicker of uncertainty. Had she gotten the date wrong? The time? She reached into her bag for her phone, an older model her son had insisted she carry. As she fumbled with it, the young couple behind her sighed audibly. "Is there a problem here?" The voice came from behind Margaret, deep and authoritative. She turned to see a middle-aged man in a perfectly tailored navy suit, his silver-streaked hair neatly combed, his eyes, so like her own, surveying the scene with quiet intensity. "Robert!" Margaret breathed, relief washing over her. The security guard straightened immediately, recognition dawning on his face. "Mr. Richardson, sir. I didn't realize—" "Evidently not," Robert said, his tone level, but with an edge that made the guard take a half-step back. This is my mother, Margaret Wilson. I believe we have a reservation at the Diamond Room." The concierge's fingers flew across her tablet. "Yes, Mr. Richardson. Of course. The private dining room is ready for you. My deepest apologies for the confusion." Margaret felt Robert's hand on her elbow, gentle but firm. "Mom, I was planning to meet you inside. You should have called when you arrived. I wanted to surprise you," she said quietly. "It seems I've caused a bit of a stir instead." A flicker of something, frustration, embarrassment, crossed Robert's face before his expression softened. You never could follow instructions, could you? There was affection in his voice now, a private joke between them. As Robert guided her through the gleaming marble lobby, Margaret felt the eyes of other shoppers on them, on her specifically, in her modest dress among a sea of designer labels. A woman in a fur coat actually stopped mid-stride to stare, her gaze traveling from Margaret's practical shoes to her weathered hand. Margaret lifted her chin slightly, a gesture Robert caught and acknowledged with the smallest of smiles. "See something you like?" he asked the woman pleasantly, his voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear. The woman flushed and hurried away. Robert pointed out a new art installation, a swirl of blue glass that caught the light streaming through the skylights. "It reminds me of that vase you used to have," he said. "The one Dad brought back from his business trip to Venice." Margaret smiled at the memory. "You broke it playing baseball in the house when you were 9. Your father was furious. Until you defended me," Robert chuckled. "Too said it was just a thing, and things can be replaced." They reached the elevator bank, where an attendant immediately ushered them into a private car. As the doors closed, sealing them in quiet luxury, Margaret studied her son's profile. The awkward, determined boy who'd scraped his knees climbing trees and built primitive computers in their garage had become this commanding man, whose name appeared in business magazines and whose mere presence changed how people behaved. "You look good, Mom," Robert said, catching her gaze in the mirrored wall. "That cardigan brings out your eyes." Margaret laughed softly. "This old thing? I've had it forever." "I know," he replied simply. "You wore it to my college graduation." The elevator doors opened directly into the Diamond Room, a space of understated elegance with panoramic views of Central Park. A hostess led them to a table by the window, pulling out Margaret's chair with a flourish. "Mrs. Wilson, Mr. Richardson, welcome to the Diamond Room. We're honored to have you with us today," the restaurant manager said, materializing beside their table. His smile was deferential, his posture attentive. "Our chef has prepared a special menu for Mr. Richardson's birthday celebration." Margaret watched as Robert handled the interaction with easy confidence, thanking the manager while making it clear they'd prefer privacy. It was a skill she'd observed developing in him over the years, the ability to be both gracious and commanding in the same breath. Once they were alone, Margaret reached across the table to squeeze her son's hand. "Happy birthday, Robbie." He smiled at the childhood nickname. "Thanks for making the trip, Mom. You didn't have to come all this way. And miss your 50th? Never." She paused, then added with a twinkle in her eye, "Though I almost didn't make it past security." Robert's expression clouded. "I'm sorry about that. I should have arranged for someone to meet you." "Nonsense!" Margaret dismissed his concern with a wave. "It was just a misunderstanding." "It wasn't," Robert said, his voice hardening slightly. "It was presumptuous and disrespectful." Margaret studied her son, noting the tension in his jaw, the slight furrow between his brows that appeared whenever something troubled him deeply. "Robert, when you were little and the neighborhood boys wouldn't let you join their baseball game, what did I tell you?" He sighed, a smile tugging at his lips despite himself. "That people's actions reveal more about them than about me." "Exactly," she nodded. "That young man and woman downstairs, they saw an old lady in a hand-mended dress and made their judgments. Their mistake isn't worth your anger." A waiter approached with champagne, pouring 2 glasses with practiced precision. Robert raised his in a toast. "To the wisest woman I know." As they sipped the champagne, "Ridiculously expensive," Robert informed her with a grin. Margaret gazed out at the park below, its trees touched with the first gold of autumn. The restaurant hummed with quiet conversation and the gentle clink of fine china. "You've built quite a life for yourself," Margaret said, taking in the respectful distance the staff maintained, the subtle nods from other diners who recognized her son. "Your father would have been proud. He thought I was crazy to drop out of college," Robert reminded her. "He thought you were taking an unnecessary risk," Margaret corrected gently. "But he always believed in you." "We both did," Robert's expression softened. "I know, Mom. That's why I wanted you here today. Not just for my birthday, but because I have news." Margaret listened intently as Robert explained his latest venture, a foundation focused on educational opportunities for children from underserved communities. The animation in his face reminded her of the boy who'd excitedly shown her his science fair projects, his eyes alight with possibility. "And we're starting with 5 cities, including right here in New York," he explained, using his fork to sketch invisible maps on the tablecloth. "The goal is to identify talented kids who might otherwise fall through the cracks and provide them with resources, mentorship, and eventually college scholarship." "It sounds wonderful," Margaret said, genuinely moved. "But why now?" Robert set down his fork, his expression turning contemplative. "I was in Seattle last month for a conference. It was pouring rain. You know how it gets there. And I ducked into this little bookshop to wait it out. There was a kid there, couldn't have been more than 16, arguing with the owner about some obscure theoretical physics concept. Reminded me of myself at that age." He paused, taking a sip of water. "I got to talking with him. Brilliant mind, self-taught mostly. Lives with his grandmother in public housing. Works after school stocking shelves to help with bills." Robert met his mother's gaze directly. "He reminded me that not everyone gets the chances I had, even with all our financial struggles back then. You and Dad always made education a priority." Margaret nodded, remembering the tight budget, the second jobs, the careful sacrifices made to ensure Robert had books, a computer when they became essential, the opportunity to visit museums and attend science camps. "We did what parents do. Not all parents can, Mom, or know how." Robert's voice was gentle but insistent. "That's what this foundation is about. Creating a support system for kids who have the ability, but not the opportunity." As their main courses arrived, perfectly seared scallops for Margaret, who'd always had a weakness for seafood, Robert outlined his vision further. The foundation wasn't just about money. It was about creating communities of learning, connecting young people with mentors in their fields of interest, building pathways to possibilities they might never have imagined otherwise. "I want to name it after Dad," Robert said, watching her carefully for her reaction. "The Thomas Wilson Foundation for Educational Opportunity." Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes, unexpected and sudden. "He would be honored," she said softly. "So honored, Robert." As they ate, the conversation shifted to family matters. Robert's daughter starting her second year of college, his son's recent engagement, the summer home on Long Island where they'd gather for Thanksgiving this year. Margaret spoke of her book club, her volunteer work at the local library, the community garden she'd helped establish in her neighborhood. "You know," Robert said between bites, "you could move closer to us. That apartment in Queens, it's getting older, and the neighborhood isn't what it used to be." Margaret smiled. "It's my home, Robert. I know every crack in the ceiling, every squeak in the floorboard. Mrs. Patel brings me samosas on Sundays, and Mr. Guzman from downstairs helps with my groceries. I could buy you a place on the Upper East Side," Robert persisted, "or near us in Connecticut. You'd have a garden 10 times the size of that community plot." "And what would I do with all that space?" Margaret asked, her tone light but her eyes serious. "No, my little apartment suits me just fine. Besides, who would help Mrs. Patel with her English practice if I moved away?" Dessert arrived, a delicate confection for Margaret and a small cake for Robert, complete with a single candle. "Make a wish," Margaret said, just as she had at every birthday since he was small. Robert smiled, closed his eyes briefly, and blew out the flame. Around them, the restaurant continued its quiet hum of activity, the afternoon sun casting long golden light across their table. "I have something for you," Margaret said. Reaching into her handbag, she pulled out a small package wrapped in simple blue paper, Robert's favorite color since childhood. "It's not much, but—" "Mom," Robert interrupted gently, "anything from you is everything to me." He unwrapped the gift carefully, revealing a vintage fountain pen nestled in a velvet-lined box. "This was Dad's," he said, recognition immediate. Margaret nodded. "He used it to sign every important document in his life. Our mortgage, your school forms, his will. It seemed fitting that you should have it now, especially with your new foundation." Robert ran his finger along the pen's smooth surface, his expression thoughtful. "I remember him letting me hold this once, explaining how the ink flowed through it. I thought it was magic. He said you could be trusted with it because you understood its value went beyond its price." Margaret recalled. Robert's eyes, so much like his father's, were bright with emotion. "I miss him," he said simply. "Every day." "I know," Margaret replied. "So do I." As Robert carefully returned the pen to its box, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. He glanced at it, frowned slightly, and declined the call. "Work," he explained. "It can wait." But the interruption seemed to have broken a spell. Robert glanced at his watch, and Margaret recognized the gesture. Time was once again a commodity to be measured, obligations to be met. "You need to go," she said, making it a statement rather than a question. "I have a conference call at 4, he admitted reluctantly. "I tried to reschedule, but it's all right," Margaret assured him. "This was lovely, Robert, truly." He signaled for the check, which appeared instantly. Margaret noticed he didn't even glance at the amount before handing over a black card that vanished and reappeared with equal efficiency. "Let me arrange a car for you," Robert said as they rose from the table. "My driver can take you home." Margaret shook her head. "The bus is perfectly fine. I enjoy the ride, gives me time to read." A familiar look crossed Robert's face, the same expression he'd worn as a teenager when she'd refused his offer to buy her a new washing machine with his first real paycheck. "Mom, please, at least let me get you a cab." Margaret considered arguing but saw the genuine concern in her son's eyes. He worried about her making the journey back to Queens alone, navigating the crowded subway, or waiting at bus stops. To him, the world was full of potential threats to this woman who had once seemed invincible, but now moved a little slower each year. "A taxi would be nice," she conceded with a small smile. "But only because it's your birthday." They compromised on a taxi, with Robert walking his mother through the mall toward the main entrance. This time, heads turned openly as they passed. The security guard from earlier stood straighter as they approached, his expression carefully neutral. Robert paused, his hand still gentle on Margaret's elbow. "Excuse me." He addressed the guard directly. What's your name?" "James Porter, sir," the man replied, tension visible in his shoulders. "Mr. Porter," Robert said, his tone conversational but carrying an unmistakable weight, "I want to be clear about something. This woman, regardless of what she's wearing or how she presents herself, is always welcome in any establishment where I conduct business. Always. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir. Absolutely, sir." Margaret tugged gently at Robert's sleeve. "Robert, that's enough." He looked down at her, something vulnerable passing briefly across his face. "It's not, actually, but we'll leave it for now." Outside, the autumn air had cooled, and Margaret pulled her cardigan closer around her shoulders. Robert hailed a taxi with an effortless gesture that brought a yellow cab swerving to the curb. Before opening the door for her, Robert turned to face his mother fully. "I've been thinking about what happened downstairs." "Already forgotten?" Margaret assured him. "No, it shouldn't be forgotten," Robert insisted quietly. "Mom, you raised me to judge people by their character, not their appearance or bank account. Somewhere along the way, I've ended up in a world that does exactly the opposite." Margaret studied her son's face, the lines of responsibility etched around his eyes, the determined set of his jaw that hadn't changed since he was a boy, defending a smaller child from playground bullies. "Your father and I never had much," she said finally, "but we always had enough. Enough to feed you, clothe you, keep a roof over our heads. Enough to teach you right from wrong. Enough love to fill a mansion. Even in our little apartment." She reached up to straighten his already perfect tie. "You've built an extraordinary life, Robert. But remember that your worth has never been in what you own or what you earn." Robert bent down to kiss her cheek. "I love you, Mom. Thank you for coming today." Wild horses couldn't have kept me away, she smiled. Now go change the world with your foundation. Make your father proud. As the taxi pulled away from the curb, Margaret watched her son through the rear window, tall and straight-backed against the gleaming backdrop of the luxury mall he could now buy several times over. She saw him turn and say something to the security guard, who nodded repeatedly, his posture attentive. The taxi merged into the flow of Manhattan traffic, carrying Margaret back toward her modest apartment in Queens. Ciao. She thought about the day's events, about the contrasts between the world she had lived in all her life and the one her son now inhabited. There was a lesson there, she thought, about appearance and reality, about the true measure of a person's worth. Her hand rested on her handbag, where she'd tucked the small cake box the restaurant had provided. A slice for later, the waiter had whispered. Mr. Richardson's instructions. Margaret smiled to herself. Some things never change. Her little boy, now one of the most powerful businessmen in America, still made sure his mother had dessert for later. In that moment, surrounded by the honking cacophony of New York traffic, Margaret felt a quiet pride that had nothing to do with wealth or status, and everything to do with the man her son had become, not because of his billions, but despite them. As the taxi stopped at a red light, she noticed a young woman at the bus stop, worn backpack at her feet, textbooks clutched to her chest. Something in the girl's determined posture reminded Margaret of Robert at that age, the same look of someone fighting uphill, dreaming beyond their circumstances. She thought of the foundation Robert was creating, of all the young people like this girl who might now have a chance they wouldn't have otherwise. The light changed, and the taxi moved forward, leaving the girl at the bus stop behind. But Margaret's thoughts remained with her, and with all the others whose lives might be touched by her son's new venture. Thomas would indeed be proud, she thought, not of the wealth Robert had accumulated, impressive though it was, but of what he was choosing to do with it. By the time the taxi pulled up in front of her apartment building, the afternoon shadows had lengthened. Mrs. Patel was watering the potted plants by the entrance and waved cheerfully. "How was your day, Mrs. Wilson?" she called. "Did you see your famous son?" "I did," Margaret replied, climbing carefully out of the taxi. "And do you know what, Mrs. Patel? He's still just my Robbie."